पृष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामी इति नमस्ते सरस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पश्चात्देशतारिणे नमस्ते सरस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पश्चात्देशतारिणे जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासादि गौर भक्तवृंद भज गौर भक्तवृंद भज गौर भक्तवृंद भज गौर भक्तवृंद भज गौर भक्तवृंद। Hare Krishna. We would like to welcome all of you all on this Sunday morning for a very special program. Very shortly we'll be hearing from His Grace Radhika Raman Prabhu on the glories of Srimad Bhagavatam. And as he was explaining yesterday, Srimad Bhagavatam is non-different from the Supreme Lord Shri Krishna. And we also know that the holy name of Krishna, the name Krishna and the personality, the person Krishna are one and the same. They are non-different. So before we dive into that nectarian ocean of the Srimad Bhagavatam, let us take first 10-15 minutes, let us taste the nectar of the holy name. So I'll request everybody, please participate in Kirtan, because what happens when we chant the holy names, it's mantra. Then it's easy to focus the mind on what we'll be hearing during the next 1.5 hours. So please don't feel shy, please sing loudly and please sing from your hearts. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, louder please, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, bolo bolo, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, bolo bolo, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, bolo bolo, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Everybody please chant loud. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. कल जो पावन Shri Harinam Sankirtan Ki Jai.
Hare Krishna. We would like to welcome all of you for this wonderful seminar this morning, and let us all welcome His Grace Radhika Raman Prabhu. He is a very notable Vaishnava scholar, is also an author of a wonderful book, and is also teaching Sanskrit at the Bhaktivedanta College. We are very, very fortunate to have him here to explain to us the glories of Srimad Bhagavatam. So let us all welcome him with a big Hari Bol. Hari Bol! Hari Bol! Hari Bol! Thank you.
Thank you, Geeta Mataji, for the kind introduction and for all the wonderful service you do here in Atlanta. Many thanks to our hosts, also Subal Sakha Prabhu and Amrita Gaurangi Mataji, for opening up their home and such a nice facility here for meeting. And thank you to all of you for being here. You've stuck around for the third part of the seminar. Today's the third and final part of the seminar, and on the glories of Bhagavatam, and it has kind of two parts to it. One is the sort of a more academic a part of it that we have to complete today, a discussion about Bhagavatam, and then the second part that I hope to do also briefly today is to discuss about how we can incorporate study of Bhagavatam into our own lives on a regular basis. And then I hope to have some time also for question and answers, because this is the last opportunity for this seminar, and so we hope to give sufficient time for that as well. So we have a lot to accomplish today, and we can get started with the Mangalacharana prayers. Om Ajnana Timirandhasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhishtam Sthapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamahyam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatham Vitam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhan Vitamscha He Krishna Karuna Sindho Dinabandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vancha Kalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya eva cha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shivasadi Gaura Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama, Rama, Hare Hare. So, if you remember, yesterday in the morning, the first session, I was talking about the various ways in which the Bhagavatam is unique, right? In terms of its vocabulary, in terms of its grammar, its poetic quality, its structure, and like that. And I realized last night that I had forgotten one thing in that list of different things that makes the Bhagavatam unique. I mean, we may not need another thing, because I think even that list is sufficient. But since there is one more thing, I might as well tell you about it. That makes the Bhagavatam different and unique. And this is that the Bhagavatam has a very stable manuscript tradition. Now, let me explain what that means. Say we have a copy of Bhagavad Gita, okay? So let's say we have a copy of Bhagavad Gita. Now, this copy of Bhagavad Gita, the verses are in there, right? This is the Gita. Now, where do you think these verses came from that are there printed in the book? Well, probably from another book that was printed before that, right? Before the BBT started to print the book, it probably came from another book that was published before that in India. And where did that book get it from, the Gita? Well, probably from another book printed even earlier, maybe early 1900s or something like that. And where did that book get it from? Well, at some point, we're going to run out of printing earlier editions, right? Because the printing press was not a common thing before a certain time period. So when you keep going earlier and earlier to earlier editions, then before that, what do you come to eventually? Yeah, handwritten manuscripts, right? Some on palm leaves, some on bark, some on handmade paper, but they become manuscripts. Manu means hand, and script means to write. They're handwritten texts. And I was explaining to you yesterday about how valuable it was to have a handwritten text, right? You remember, it's not easy to get it copied, it's very expensive, it takes a lot of time. And so having a book, a handwritten book, was a big deal. I mean, these days it's so easy for us to get a copy of Bhagavad Gita, and they're so inexpensive thanks to the BBT and how many books it publishes and all the book distributors and how many they distribute. It's very inexpensive, but in those days it was a very valuable thing. However, there's another side also to the handwritten manuscript edition or copies, and that's that as time goes on, if you think back in history, when a book is first written down by its author for the first time, it's written down in a manuscript, in a palm leaf or something like that, and then it gets copied by someone else, and then someone else copies it from that person, and someone else copies it from that person. Over time, what happens? There are mistakes that are introduced in the copying process. This is not because there are mistakes in the book, it's because there's mistakes in human beings, because we are fallible, and so when we write, all kinds of mistakes are introduced. So, for example, have you ever seen when children, they read, they're learning how to read, then they'll read a paragraph, so they'll read something, then they'll look away for a second, and they'll come back, but they'll come back to this wrong line, the same word on a different line, right? And they just skip something. That's called eye skip. Your eyes jump from one place to another place on the same page, but you've just missed a couple lines of text. Or they're getting to the end of the line and then they go to the next line and they accidentally skip a line. Or they begin with the same line again. So those types of mistakes children make all the time. But the fact is, even adults make those mistakes when we're copying texts down. And these scribes, remember, scribes get paid, this is their job, right? And the payment is on what basis? It's on the basis of how many books you copy. Yes, the more books you copy, the more money you make. It's just like a printer. The more books you print, the more money you make. So, what are they looking for in the copying of the books? speed, right? It's the number one goal, is to get it done fast, because then they can move on to the next book and get paid for it. And once you copy the book and you hand it to that person is going to discover the mistakes you made a long time after you've been paid. Yes? And half the time they may not even know whether it's a mistake or not, because typically when we read scriptures, we don't read it thinking, now is this a mistake? We don't think like that, right? We're thinking this is the truth. So if we don't understand something, then why don't I understand it? Krishna will reveal it to me. But it could be a mistake, right? The scribe made a certain mistake while copying it. Now the reason I mention this is because over time these mistakes compound. One scribe makes mistakes, the other scribe comes after him, copies from the first scribe, copies down the same mistakes and adds more of his own from that. And the third scribe copies from the second and adds more of his own. And in this way, over time, the texts change a lot. What makes it worse is the fifth scribe down realizes that the fourth scribe made a mistake and he wants to correct those mistakes. But in correcting those mistakes, he sometimes introduces new mistakes, right? Corrects it the wrong way. So the word was A, it was the mistake turned it into B, so he corrects it, but instead of correcting it back to A, because he has no way of knowing, he corrects it back to C. And so now you've got a word that looks correct, but actually is not correct, which is even more difficult to spot the next time around, because now it looks correct. Over time, this compounds to a point where you can actually lose the original text in many significant ways. And one very good example of this is the Mahabharata. Madhvacharya, he says that the Mahabharata, the text that we have today, is corrupted, he says. And by corrupted, I don't mean it's bad for us. I mean, over time, the text has changed so much that many parts of it, we don't know whether they are authentic or not. And one good example of it is the fact that North India and South Indian versions of the Mahabharata are very, very different. Sometimes different by entire chapters. For example, we know the story of Vyasadeva. He is born as the son of Parashara Muni and Satyavati. And Satyavati, she's a boat lady, right? And Parashara Muni is crossing the river. And along the journey, he becomes attracted to her. And he asks her for a son, for a child to have with her. And she agrees, and they have a child. And Parashara Muni is pleased by this, and he blesses her that she will still get married and remain a virgin and everything will be okay. But they have a really, really great son as a result. And that's Srila Vyasadeva. He's the son of Parashara Muni and Satyavati. Now, this story is told in the North Indian version of the Mahabharata, but the South Indian version is not like that. You see, the fact that the author of the Vedas, Vyasadeva, is born outside of wedlock is something that the South Indians cannot tolerate, because South India is a lot more about ritual. You have to make sure everything is done nicely and properly and so on. So for the South Indians, no, this can't happen. It's, oh my God, this is not right. So what happens in that version is, when he makes a request, they stop on an island in the middle of the Ganga, and all the demigods come down, and they do a huge marriage ceremony for Parashara Muni and Satyavati. They get married nicely, then they have a child, and then Vyasadeva is born. Right? Now, the point being that the Mahabharata has so many variations, that the basic story, although we're familiar with that basic story, and there's nothing wrong with the basic story, all the details you can't be sure of. This is why our acharyas typically don't quote a whole lot of verses from Mahabharata. We don't base our whole philosophy on the Mahabharata. We tell the story as a nice support, but we're not basing our philosophy on it, except for a handful of very special verses. Other than that, not. Now, here's the thing. Those types of differences mean that over time you don't know what the original text is. And this point is even made by Krishna in Bhagavad Gita, right? when he says, Yogo Nashta Parantapa. Over time, the knowledge is lost. Sometimes it's lost because people introduce their own ideas into the text, either by writing or by speaking. Sometimes it's lost just by the force of time. Sa kalene hamahata yogo nashta parantapa. Over the course, he says, of great time, kaleneha mahata, over a large period of time, and this only happens over large periods of time, when memory is lost and you lose the original text. And so he says, therefore I have to come back again. And I'm now Saivayam Mayatevya Yoga Prokta Puratana. Today I'm telling you that same knowledge again, because it's been lost over the course of time. This is something that's well accepted among scholars, but the point is, even our own tradition is aware of this fact, that time destroys the purity of knowledge. Therefore Krishna has to come back and repeat that knowledge again. Now here's what makes the Bhagavatam so special, is that the manuscript tradition of the Bhagavatam is very, very stable. In other words, you can go back to the earliest manuscripts that we still have of Srimad Bhagavatam, and you can look at the most recent printings, and the differences between them are next to nothing. They're negligible. They're like tiny little things like cha here versus there. And that's very, very impressive. Same thing goes with Bhagavad Gita, by the way. I said all this about the Mahabharata. Don't lose your faith in Bhagavad Gita. Okay, Gita is there in Mahabharata, but the Bhagavad Gita was preserved separately from the Mahabharata, like we do today, right? We have copies of Gita we distribute, not Mahabharata. So the Gita was preserved separately because it's the words of Krishna. And again, the variations within Bhagavad Gita are next to nothing over time. But occasionally you can hear it, right? Occasionally, even when Prabhupada gives a class, have you ever heard him quote the verse, Janma Karma Chame Divyam, right? And what's the second line that he often gives? If you listen to Prabhupada's classes, he says, Janma Karma Chame Divyam. He says, Yo Janati Tattvataha. And if you read the Gita as it's printed, it says, Evam Veti Tattvataha, right? So it means exactly the same thing. Yo Janati and Evam Veti. Exactly the same thing. Veti and Janati are synonyms. They both mean to know. The one who knows me in truth. But the point is, even in our own time, it's clear, it's obvious. With the Gita, the differences are negligible. But with Bhagavatam, it's particularly impressive, because you have a work of 18,000 verses. And when you get another Purana of that size, like Skanda Purana, oh my, there are so many variations to Skanda Purana and Padma Purana. They say in Sanskrit circles that anything you want to have in the scriptures, it must come from Skanda Purana. Right? You can find it in Skanda Purana. Create a verse and say it comes from Skanda Purana. Because no one knows really what's in the Skanda Purana or what's in the Padma Purana. You can get practically anything from it, because over time the manuscripts have really, really changed. But Bhagavatam is very stable in its manuscript tradition. And what that means is that we can use the Bhagavatam as the gold standard for deciding what is the truth of the matter. So, for example, if you read about Queen Kunti in Mahabharata, she's a very, very different character than Queen Kunti in Srimad Bhagavatam. In Mahabharata, Queen Kunti asks her 5 sons, the Pandavas, when they have the Lakshagriha, the house of lac, then she asks the Pandavas to go find a mother and her 5 children, to bring them into the palace so they can burn and die in their place, so that people will think that the Pandavas died, right? Now, she has to make the world think that the Pandavas died. But that's a horrible way of doing it, right? Killing 5 mothers. And can you imagine Queen Kunti in the Bhagavatam, the Queen Kunti of the Bhagavatam doing that kind of thing? Impossible, right? I mean, she's this really, really wonderful, soft-hearted devotee who's completely devoted to Lord Krishna. So which Queen Kunti do we accept? Well, okay, obviously we have faith in Bhagavatam, but I'm saying even from an academic perspective, the one you want to trust is Srimad Bhagavatam, because the Bhagavatam has been unchanged over these thousands of years. And the Mahabharata, not reliable. Different parts of India, different versions of the story that come across, right? So another reason to take Bhagavatam very seriously, and another reason why we choose the scriptures that we choose. Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, these are 100% reliable scriptures, right? And people often say, well, there's so many Puranas out there, so many scriptures. How do I know which one I should choose, which one I should read? This Purana says this thing, that scripture says this thing. And it's true. It's true. But, you can read it, you can accept it at your own risk, essentially. Whereas these ones are quality tested. Right? They're tested, they're verified by the Acharyas. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu read this Srimad Bhagavatam that we have. Krishna himself, 500 years ago. And he accepted it as authoritative, as the words of the Lord. So we've got verification. It's like buying medicine from CVS or Walgreens or someplace, and then buying medicine from some internet pharmacy or some black market source. You may get it for 1/10 of the price, but you eat it at your own risk, right? Is there quality control? Are you getting placebo pills instead of the actual pills? No one knows, right? It's at your own risk. Whereas if you get it from a doctor, prescribed by a doctor, from a verified pharmacy, from a pharmacist who's supervising the whole procedure, then, okay, you're getting something that is going to work, it's going to have an effect. And so that is the same thing with the Shastras, with the scriptures. In Mahabharata itself, Yudhishthira Maharaj says, there's this beautiful verse where he says, when he's meeting the yaksha, so they're looking for water and they cannot find any water, and so he sends his brothers to go find the water, and they come to a pond, and when they go to drink the water, there's a yaksha who lives there, a spirit of that lake, and he stops them and he says, wait, you cannot, this is my water. If you want to drink it, you have to first answer my questions. And the brothers don't listen to him, the 4 brothers, and they drink and they fall down. And but Maharaj Yudhishthira, he agrees. And he asks a series of questions from Maharaj Yudhishthira, right? And he answers all of them brilliantly. The whole speech is really interesting. But there's one verse, and this is one of the verses that Prabhupada quotes from Mahabharata, where the yaksha asks the most difficult question from Maharaj Yudhishthira, which is, how do you know what is dharma? What is the right path that human beings are supposed to follow? How do you know what is your duty? And Maharaj Yudhishthira speaks this beautiful, beautiful verse where he says, it goes like this, he says, Tarko pratishtha shrutayo vibhinna naiko rishiryasya matam pramanam. Tarko pratishtha shrutayo vibhinna naiko rishiryasya matam pramanam. Dharmasya tattvam nihitam guhayam mahajano yena gata sapantha. The last line you've probably heard if you've listened to any lectures by Prabhupada or other devotees. Mahajano yena gata sapantha. But it comes at the end of the last phrase of this beautiful verse, where Maharaj Yudhishthira gives all the other alternatives before he comes to the solution. He says, essentially he's telling the yaksha, this is a very good question and a very confusing question. What is dharma? He says, Tarko pratishtha. By logic, you cannot decide what the right thing to do is. Because, you can make a good argument for just about anything. And when you listen to someone making a very good argument, you feel very convinced by that argument. And then you hear another argument in the opposite direction, and you feel very convinced by that. And no one to this day in history has been able to even prove the existence of God through logic. And the Vedanta Sutra says this right off the bat. Tarko pratishtanat. The scriptures tell us right up front, it says you're wasting your time. You won't be able to prove God's existence using logic. It's going to be impossible. Why? Why is it going to be impossible to prove the existence of God using logic? Can anyone say? Yes, we're in the material platform. Good.
It goes beyond our sense perception.
Goes beyond our sense perception. Excellent. Yes, you have to go beyond time, right? If we were, suppose, look at it the opposite way. If we were able to prove God's existence using logic, what would it mean? if I were to prove that Krishna exists using just logic, no scripture, just logic.
We are superior to God.
Yeah, it means in the end we are superior to God, right? Because if I can figure God out using my brain, then it means my brain is greater than God. Right? Just like any computer, no matter what a supercomputer it might be, as a computer engineer, you should be able to pull it apart and understand the whole thing, right? I mean, someone did. That's why they put together the computer. It means what? That you are greater than the computer. Your intelligence supersedes the intelligence of the computer because you're able to define it, understand it, put it together. If we are able to do that with God, with our own brain, then it means that whoever we thought was God is not God. I must be God because I was able to figure him out, right? But I know I'm not God. So then, by definition, if God is within our intelligence, then it means that we've gotten the wrong person here. This is not God. So, tarko pratishtha, he says. Tarko pratishtha, you cannot establish God by logic or even dharma, the right path. So you think, okay, I have to go to the scriptures. But then he says, shrutayo vibhinna. The scriptures say many different things also. And there's many different scriptures. The shrutis vibhinna, there's so many of them. I can read the Bible and I can read the Quran, or I can read Shiva Purana, or I can read Devi Mahatmya, or I can read Bhagavad Gita, or I can read, so many options are there. And they're all saying different things, and they're all convinced they're the absolute truth. Tarko pratishtha shrutayo vibhinna naiko rishir yasya matam pramanam. And the philosophers, the sages, matam na pramanam. He said you can't get a single standard from them. And if you've studied the history of philosophy, you will know that every philosopher, you read Plato, and he is the most convincing philosopher in the world. And yet his disciple Aristotle comes and rejects Plato's ideas and becomes the most convincing philosopher. And then the next person shows up after that, and he's the most intelligent and brilliant person. And the only way you can become a philosopher is if you disagree with everyone who came before you and give your own idea. Yes? What is the only way you can get a PhD? Do you know? Means you have to prove something original. Original means for the first time. For the first time means that you have just about contradicted everyone else who came before you. Right? So that's the definition. This is why no PhD has ever been able to give us guidance about the nature of God and the existence and the path we're supposed to follow. Because he says, Naiko rishir yasya matam pramanam. Yes, he's the smartest guy you know, but the next guy who comes is going to defeat him, right? And you realize that. If you work in academics, you realize that in the end the whole thing is kind of pointless, because no matter how brilliant of an idea you come up with, the next generation that's going to come after you is going to trash it. And then what's the use, right? Your book is going to be outdated and no one's ever going to read it again. That's why better to write about Krishna, because at least that way it's eternally relevant. Otherwise you prove some brilliant theory about something, and who cares? In the end it's defeated and the new person has a better idea after. And they probably do, they probably are smarter than you. So he says, Naiko rishid yasya matam pramanam. He says, dharmasya tatvam nihitam guhayam. He gets very frustrated and he says, the truth about dharma must be hidden somewhere in a cave. Nihitam guhayam. It must be somewhere in a cave, somewhere someone hid it. Where is dharma? How do I know what dharma is? And sometimes people translate guhayam as the heart. It's hidden in the core of the heart. But in either case, he's frustrated. He's saying, how can I know what dharma is? And in the last line, he gives the conclusion to that. He gives the final conclusion, the solution to the problem, where he says, therefore, I have